Hello and welcome to another episode of Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and, dare I say, entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. My name is Zach, and I'm one of your hosts.
And as always, I am your other host, Aaron.
And this week, we are going to be talking about Bungie, Sony's live service ambitions, and more importantly, Marathon, which released relatively recently on March 5th. But before we dive into that, I do want to say some things. First, I want to say, please like and subscribe. Please hit that engagement button on whatever platform of choice you decide to listen to this show, whether that be YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. If you're one of the 5 people on Google Podcasts, hit that thing a like. Send that thing a like, whatever. Hit that thing a like. Doesn't matter.
Hit that thing a like.
Hit that thing a like. Also, thank you for existing and being here. To all of our returning and even perhaps new listeners, we really appreciate you. And if you want to help us out with one more thing, that's please share this episode with a friend, or as we like to say, a mortal enemy. It's truly all the same to us.
Yes, indeed. It is. And it is, of course, just very much appreciated. Any sort of, as they would have said, back in the days of MST, keep circulating the tapes. Basically just, share the show. It's a word of mouth is the best way for us to grow and get in front of new ears. And yeah, we really appreciate anything that you can do to help us in that endeavor, because we really don't generally pay to sort of promote the show. It's kind of a grassroots endeavor by us for you to enjoy and disseminate at your leisure. But yeah, all of that fun stuff. I fear I've lingered too long in the please help us out with engagement button territory.
You really have, but I won't hold it against you in this one situation.
Your grace is, as always, a shining light in my life, Zach.
Well, I try my best. So
much appreciated.
You know what I'm realizing here, Aaron, is that really this story of Marathon is truly a story of Sony and their live service ambitions, and ultimately mostly failures so far. And I think truly the interesting thing that I'm also realizing is if it wasn't for Sony, we'd be missing out on a massive part of kind of the cultural meme that currently exists, which is that every game that's a live service that people want to fail or think is going to fail is referred to as a Concord-like.
Yep.
Concord being, of course, a game that we've talked about. We have a whole episode on it, so I'm not going to dive into it too much, but it was a game by Firewalk Studios, which was acquired from Probably Monsters by Sony to be this live service hero shooter that failed just horrifically. And so it relates to Marathon in the sense that some people really want Marathon to fail. And of course, that's another Sony live service game.
Yeah. Concord being the reason I started laughing when you said that we had an entire episode on Concord, I was like, well, I mean, statistically speaking, if you have any sort of online presence and you talk about stuff in the video game space, you have talked about Concord, right? It was the biggest failure of live service as an endeavor that the industry has seen. Really, it's pretty remarkable the degree to which that game just absolutely flopped, right? So it is a cultural touchstone now, synonymous with failure in the live industry, or the live service space for games. It is now a full-on proper noun beyond its own name. And the fear now / hope from some corners of the internet is that any live service game that people do not want to succeed will just become a Concord, or, people are worried for Sony that something will be another Concord because, again, we just can't can't get past how big a massive failure that was. So Marathon has what I think we can call a pretty storied history, and we did do an entire episode on Marathon up to this point, talking about the fact that its initial what was it, the alpha testing that they did, that did not go particularly well. People did not enjoy the experience very much, and then there were all of the issues going on with an artist named Anti-Real's work being plagiarized for early ideation in the game that ended up making its way into that alpha build. That artist has since been credited in what they have called a satisfactory conclusion to that issue. So I give you this very, very brief rundown, not to say don't go listen to our old episode about it, which will be much more in-depth about a lot of the sort of weirdness going on with Marathon as of last year, its intended release date. But rather to encourage you to go listen to that so that you have kind of the full backstory if you're not already familiar with it. But yeah, there's been a lot of drama leading up to this point, and Marathon has finally come out. Everybody is deeply concerned that it's going to be another Concord, or very excited that it's going to be another Concord, and it has landed, and it's not Concord.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even Highguard, which
It's also not Highguard.
Had a bunch of, CCU concurrent player issues upon release. So that's good. That's a bit of a sigh of relief. As I had mentioned earlier, Marathon came out on March 5th, and it did hit a peak of 88,000 players. And, as being reported by Alenia, the DAU, or the daily active users for the game, are also fairly healthy. We're talking about people, 280,000 players playing the game throughout the day, specifically on the weekend. And then during weekdays, the metric is a little bit closer to 250,000 daily active users. So people are enjoying the game. They're coming back to it. It's got an 88% very positive on Steam last time I checked. When I looked at Metacritic, it was an 8.1, which is, again, pretty good. The main problem here is that Alenia Insights, which is getting referenced for a lot of the data here, is saying the game's only really generated, likely, $55 million in gross revenue. However, we don't know how much the game took to develop. That's one of the problems. And then the other problem is Sony bought Bungie for $3.7 billion because they thought they were going to be making oodles of money in 2022 from whatever new IP, which ended up being Marathon, or not new IP, but new game from Bungie, which ended up being Marathon, and Destiny 2, which has generally not been the case. I believe, for example, right now, Destiny 2 is actually struggling to maintain 10,000 concurrent players on Steam, at least, which is, oh, how the mighty fall.
Yeah. The Sony absolutely got their, as with everything to do with their live service, and we'll talk. The challenge here is going to be actually spending the first portion of this conversation more on the numbers that lay the basis for the speculation that we're going to be doing in the latter half of the episode, without just getting directly into that. But suffice it to say, much like with almost everything to do with Sony's live service sort of push, they either got their hand on the ball extremely late or just, misread what was working or not working within any given, system here. So they 100% picked up Destiny 2 through Bungie on the decline. It's not to say that Destiny 2 didn't have a couple of good years under Sony, but they did not pick it up while it was peaking. They picked it up after it had peaked. Or right around the time of the peak, which meant that the decline was still yet to come. And when it came swiftly and completely. So, I mean, Destiny 2 is not in great shape. And Marathon is currently certainly drawing higher numbers than Destiny 2 at the moment, both, I believe, in concurrent and daily user. But it's also reviewing considerably better, both in terms of like the sort of sliding scale that Steam does, and I think in terms of like Metacritic bits, but I actually, now that I say that, I realize I haven't sourced that, so perhaps disregard that last bit. But Marathon is, by all accounts, performing reasonably, I mean, extremely well for a small to mid-sized game.
Well, especially if you compare it to how it was received in 2025. I mean, I think largely it's indisputable that this game is better off for having been put in the oven again for another year.
Oh God, yeah.
The reception from people is night and day. I do think that a lot of the criticism that happened to the game last year has lingered kind of in the zeitgeist for certain people in the games industry, certain people that are, interested in those kind of games. And so I do think it hurt them to have such an initial negative reception. But at the same time, like, the real problem here, just to dig into it, is apparently the game is very hardcore PvP focused. We're not talking about a game that, Aaron and I are probably going to play.
This is where we get to one of my my like personal touchstone moments for this conversation. Because on a conceptual level, and yes, to get into the Marathon specific bits about, for some reason, like not for some reason, but why it might not be connecting with the broadest possible audience. Because, you've got your three different sort of, touch points for success or failure, right? On one end, you've got your Concord, 2 degrees above that, you've got Highguard. Somewhere in the middle, you've got Marathon, and then all the way off to this side, you've got Arc Raiders, right? Which just like exploded, massive hit, great. Helldivers 2, great, exploded, massive hit, did gigantic numbers, printing money forever, whatever. Marathon somewhere in the middle there in terms of success. But the fascinating thing to me, and the thing that drives me actually a little bit crazy, it's like that itch you just can't quite scratch, you can't quite get there. Marathon seems to be the most authentically artistic of any of these games, both in terms of its visual style, which I have heard described in equal measure as like caustic and chaotic and completely illegible, and also inspired and intriguing and unique and genuinely actually artistic and expressive. Meaning the aesthetics of this game are so bold that they're divisive. And I can't think of the last time an online multiplayer shooter was, criticized for being too artistically, bold. That's crazy. And then you do have the gameplay elements, which we'll dig into a little bit more because there are both positives and negatives to this as well, where it seems like, to paraphrase Bellular, no edges have been sanded off here. This is very much the intended experience is meant to be hardcore, brutal, punishing, and rewarding in equal measure due to that level of punishment, kind of a la a Souls-like or a FromSoft game in general. And on one level, the part of my brain that craves authenticity and artistic integrity within a published work is looking at Marathon and going, I want to buy this, whether or not, it is going to be a game that I come back to, forever and ever and ever. I want to reward that level of like artistic intention in a space that does not really have that much of it on the surface, right? Like, it's not to say that there is an artistry that goes into those games. Obviously there is. But, to have something this, like, garish and weird and unique out there, I feel like that's such a breath of fresh air conceptually that I want to reward a game for being singularly what it is, possibly at its own expense. But, to give you a second now to talk, Zach, what it is specifically on a gameplay level is basically my personal kryptonite. As a player of games. So I don't think I probably will be buying it, just because it's the antithesis of a game that would be made for me, if there were to be such a thing. So yeah, Zach, now to the gameplay bits. But yeah, I just need to vent that out for my own personal edification. All apologies.
No, I mean, if I remember back to our original episode, I think we were never critical of the art style either.
No.
I mean, I think the art style is interesting. I like the kind of neon colors, the bright colors. I think it's very different. And I think, honestly, what you just described, Aaron, is that it is not at all a AAA game in terms of, I would not say from a polish, although actually one of the things that people do take issue with is the first time user experience, also called FATUI as an acronym. Very funny acronym. But regardless of that, it's a very polished looking game. Apparently the systems are very deep. It's very clear a lot of money went into the game. But in terms of what AAA normally does, which is tries to be a little bit more approachable, tries to have the largest target audience possible, generally that means that some artistic intention and things that would be off-putting are sanded down, to Bellular's point in his video. That's not happening with this game. So it'll be very interesting to see how Sony reacts to Bungie really making a very targeted extraction shooter game focused on the more hardcore elements of the fandom and not on the general audience. And then to your point about gameplay, really the main criticism is that the first-time user experience is super clunky. The game doesn't really hold your hand with a PvE mode or a mode where it's easier to get your stuff back. It throws you right into the game, and you're immediately dealing with all the sweaty, hardcore players or the people that are equally as confused about what's going on as you are, navigating all of these really clunky UI menus, trying to understand what your mission is, what your objective is in this game. I do want to clarify, Aaron and I haven't played this, so this is all coming from, different outlets like the Alenia outlet, Bellular, News, Forbes, etc. But these are not outlets that are they're not outlets that typically get judged for being like bad gamers, air quotes, although I think that's a really stupid criticism of games journalism in a lot of ways. But regardless, these are not people that don't enjoy the game. A lot of these people have actually said they like the game a lot, but you have to suffer to kind of get to the part where it's enjoyable and you understand the systems and whatnot. And that's a lot to ask from new people. So people are going to bounce off of this game.
Yeah. It almost seems, based on the variety, and I've actually tried to intake a fair amount of variety of media coverage about Marathon, and if you can feel in your ears and sort of like the auditory experience of listening to this podcast that I have furrowed my brow and am clenching my temples, just in sort of consternation. Yes, that is happening, because I discovered an entire like rabbit hole of YouTube that seems to be bizarrely adopting the socio-political language of the far right in some cases, but definitely is just angry at Marathon for existing at the same time as Arc Raiders. And I'm not getting into all of that, but it was a very weird rabbit hole to find on YouTube, just like this whole contingent of people who have like built factions and just want Arc Raiders to defeat Marathon, as if there isn't technically room for both of them. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm going to unclench now and re-zen back into the conversation. Among the more reputable individuals that we have sourced information from about Marathon, it does really seem like the game is almost belligerently difficult and belligerently resistant to onboarding players elegantly. Like, it almost feels like it's trying to alienate people so that the ones who survive the onboarding process are the target audience. Obviously, I'm projecting a fair amount of intention onto a developer that I do not know the individuals who would be making these decisions, so I can't claim that that's actually the case, but that does seem to be the general vibe. Which is, again, strategically so atypical for a game like this that you would, generally speaking, want to launch to the widest possible audience and build the highest number of both daily active users and concurrent players, so that you can fill your lobbies and no one's going to be looking at your concurrent numbers and pointing fingers and chuckling and whatever. But yeah, the between the first time user experience just being apparently pretty abysmal, the user interface being difficult to parse is a pretty frequent criticism levied against the game. And then just the general sweatiness of the overall experience, it definitely is not meant to be a game for everyone. I think that the first time user experience stuff is obviously not entirely intentional. I think that a lot of that is the Alenia Substack bits definitely speculated that some of that was due to the fact that the server slam was so close to the actual launch date that there was no time to implement changes learned during the server slam. But, one way or the other, it does seem like the game is alienating a lot of people, but the ones who are surviving that onboarding process seem to actually love the experience. I think that's worth pointing out.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing just to mention here, I mean, you mentioned Arc Raiders earlier. It's one of the games that Sony's likely going to be comparing Marathon against just because they've come out sort of close enough to each other. And Arc Raiders has really illustrated the crazy success that an extraction shooter game can find if it's marketed properly. I mean, the 24-hour peak as of yesterday for that game is still 136,000 players, and it hit a maximum CCU or concurrent player count of 488,000. So like, Arc Raiders, crazy successful game. The Alenia article does a great job of illustrating, though, that people played Arc Raiders, they immediately understood the game loop. The game focuses more on a PvE cooperative kind of focus. From the extraction perspective, you're actually sometimes working with other players that could potentially be hostile to take on bigger NPC threats. It's much less, oh no, is this person going to kill me for no reason? Am I going to get griefed, right? So generally speaking, Arc Raiders is a much more narratively focused, cooperative extraction experience that is catering to a more... it's catering to a wider audience. And also, I think that it has a niche art style, but it's a little bit less offensive to the majority of people than Marathon is.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reasons why I think Arc Raiders was doing a little bit better. Its first time user experience ultimately, though, it looks like is one of the bigger differentiators, because that Alenia Insights article, they had that side-by-side for the server slams between the two games, and Arc Raiders saw a massive jump of 80% in their copies or pre-orders sold after the server slam compared to Marathon's 49% increase in sales. So I think you can largely probably attribute that 30% difference as being people easily onboarding to the experience and not bouncing off of it, because the game just does a much better job of tutorializing things for you and illustrating what the purpose of the game is and what you should be doing. And ultimately, that's something Marathon seemingly struggles with. So I think it's just worth bringing that out. And since we're talking about CCU metrics, we're throwing all this stuff around, I think it's also important to compare it to two other games real quick. First, I'm just going to mention Slay the Spire 2, because I think it's the quicker one to get through. Slay the Spire 2 released around the same time as Marathon. Obviously, that's a pretty indie game. And it had over 100,000 concurrent players at one point in time. Massively well-received indie game. It beat Marathon in terms of concurrent players. It may even have more daily active users than Marathon. I don't have access to that data. Just wanted to bring it up, though, because I'm assuming from, everything in media storytelling, right, Aaron? I feel like it probably doesn't look great that this indie game beat Marathon. Bungie, this legacy studio known for Halo. I'm assuming Sony's not super thrilled about that. And then the other thing, Helldivers 2, which is a Sony studio, they very clearly were hoping that this game was going to surpass the success of Helldivers 2, which maxed out at a CCU of 458,000 people. It didn't even do that. And actually, currently, the 24-hour peak for Helldivers 2 is 64,000 players, which is more than the current 24-hour peak for Marathon, which is 41,000.
Years later.
Yeah. So, doing the comparison game, Sony's probably not very thrilled with this investment.
I think that just looking at the numbers, there's almost no way that Sony executives are jumping up and down and clapping their hands with glee at the numbers that Marathon put up. But this is the part where I start to get deeply curious, right? Because based on everything I've read and based on everything I've seen, I do not know that there is a team of executives in the gaming space that are so... I mean, and I'm going to say this, and it's going to immediately sound like the most ridiculous thing I've ever said, because never underestimate an executive's capacity to be out of touch. But I can't imagine that the executives at Sony are so incredibly out of touch that they listened to the pitches for Marathon, watched the progress on Marathon, play tested Marathon, ideally attempted to understand what Marathon was and what Bungie was going for, and then looked at the final shippable product and said, surely this product is positioned to compete at the same level as Helldivers 2 or Arc Raiders. Slay the Spire is, of course, a bit of an outlier because it is the reasonably well anticipated sequel to a beloved indie game that was, a breakout hit during its original run. So it definitely probably doesn't look good for an indie game to outpace Bungie's newest shooter. But when you look at how absolutely bonkers niche this product is meant to be, it really does feel like, how could they have expected it to do much better? And there's almost an argument to be made that if this game had launched to the widest possible audience, its reviews would almost certainly be worse, right? Because more people would be demanding refunds than actually sticking with the game, because the game is bouncing people left and right because it's so alienating and specific. I know we're kind of getting towards like second half of the episode territory with this line of thought, but the idea that this game, it would be like looking at, okay, my favorite screenwriter, Charlie Kaufman, has just done a new short film, and a couple of smaller projects that are basically being released to libraries as like things for people to rent at a library. And I find that to be a fascinating distribution method for an Academy Award-winning screenwriter, and one of the more interesting artistic voices, just active in the world. And no one would expect a weird niche specific Charlie Kaufman short film to do Avatar 3 numbers, right? Just because that's not what the product is designed to do. So it trips me out that we are by necessity still comparing Marathon to these larger blockbuster popcorn, comparison games, when it is not really that in practice based on all available evidence.
Yeah, it is interesting seeing them going from a game like Destiny 2, or even I would argue Halo, if we want to go all the way back, which not very hardcore in my opinion. Well, certainly not Destiny. I think Destiny is supposed to be about as approachable as you can get for a game. And then move to Marathon. I wonder if Sony thought that the Bungie brand and the brand of Destiny and Halo and whatnot would bring over enough people to make up for the difference. But the reality is like, you're just hoping for people to not refund at that point, because if the game's targeting a hardcore audience, you're not going to convert most people into hardcore players. You might convert some people, but you're not going to convert most people. I will say, to their credit, based on what Alinea Insights is reporting, we're actually seeing a pretty solid conversion rate of people that played Halo and Destiny or just enjoy the Bungie brand giving this game a chance. There's a pretty strong correlation based on the data that they showed. But, you're only going to do so much. You're not going to make me a hardcore extraction shooter player, more than likely, just because I have a, nostalgia for your brand. That's a big ask, especially for anyone that's like an actual adult. So, it's strange that it was allowed to turn into such kind of a niche target audience for the game.
Yeah.
Especially because I feel like, I like to think Sony knows how to effectively deduce what a target audience for a game is. They have a lot of success with their single player titles, at least, but like, I don't know, maybe they truly are so inept when it comes to games as a service, these multiplayer games. They just don't know. And they truly put all of that decision making on the Bungie team, and the Bungie team just decided this is what they wanted to make, which in some ways is very commendable. Because again, this is not even a bad game. It's just a strange game to spend over, $3.7 billion on. And obviously that's not entirely fair because they bought the entire studio, which comes with Destiny and da-da-da-da. But it's just very clear, like, this is probably not what Sony was envisioning for their first live service game with Bungie. And I actually think, and I'll let you respond, but I do think this is probably a good transition into one of the next bullet points for our second section of the discussion, which is just discussing Sony's kind of failed track record with live service games, with the exception of Helldivers, of course.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fine moment to sort of migrate over to Failure Town, where Sony has been really making a home for themselves in the live service space. It's kind of a boulevard of broken dreams over there, all things considered. And the most fascinating angle of this to me is that, to peel back the curtain a little bit, Zach, you and I have been trying to keep a reasonably close eye on Marathon since the last time we talked about it, because the situation back then was a pretty righteous shit show, right? Like, hot off the heels of Concord, a massive failure, as we have covered, legendary, unlikely to be forgotten industry, flare gun of a failure. Hot off the heels of that, the next game, and a bunch of cancellations that we'll go through, the next game that's coming out is Marathon, and it enters the public eye, and it is immediately either divisive or absolutely disliked and memed on into oblivion. And then the bad PR with the plagiarism pops in, and it's just a bad situation built on what appeared to be not an incredible game. So we knew that when the game came out, it would largely be the signpost by which we might be able to read the future of Bungie, and possibly the future of Sony's live service ambitions at large, right? And I can't speak for you exactly, Zach, but I definitely did not see this landing coming for Marathon. I expected either a much more conclusive sort of failure or a much more rousing success. I did not expect the needle to land somewhere towards the dead middle, which does make, just to me, the remainder of this conversation all the more interesting, is that the place that the game has landed is not definitive by any stretch. It kind of leaves more questions than answers, which is such a unique position to be in, to be able to kind of talk about this as it's happening.
Yeah, it really is an interesting position in the sense of, like, this is probably, in some ways, part of me kind of feels like this is the worst option for Sony, because if
Yeah.
it was a
Yeah.
horrific failure, they could be done with it. They wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. Now, would that look really bad for their live service ambitions? Absolutely. If it was a complete success, it would look amazing for their live service ambitions, and like the choice would be easy. Like, obviously you keep the game running. Like, here's the next big live service game. Congrats. You figured it out, Sony. You know, you've got two
Finally.
now. And that's not what happened. So now they're at this like weird crossroads, and we'll get into like what options they have available to them. But like they're at this weird crossroads where they really haven't sold as many copies as they probably would have liked to. And also a little fun tidbit is 70% of the copies sold are on PC, and only 19% are on Sony's own platform, PlayStation. So they're not even making, you know, as much money as they could, as if this was like predominantly a PlayStation release. So like, yeah, it's really a strange spot for them. And then just kind of mentioning some other recent things, right? Like we had the Last of Us multiplayer project, which was canceled a while ago. And then they had the Blue Point Studios was working on a God of War multiplayer game, reportedly, before they were shut down as a studio. But that God of War project was shut down in January of 2025. And then obviously Concord didn't work out. And even the one game that has had a decent amount of visibility that isn't Marathon, which is Horizon Hunters and Gathering, or Hunters Gathering. I always think it's Hunter and Gatherer because of the stupid. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's getting memed on because people don't like that this franchise that is generally more realistic is now very cartoony. And also, most companies that try to do the Monster Hunter genre of game, they fail miserably. Epic tried it with, I'm blanking on the name of the game, but it didn't really work out, turning, you know, Monster Hunter into more of a live service game. Like, truly, the only studio that can handle it is the studio that's been doing Monster Hunter for a long period of time. So I wouldn't be surprised if Horizon Hunters Gathering doesn't do particularly well, because it hasn't been received all that great.
No, I mean, visually it's not connecting with people, and I actually also like, I fully recognize that the Horizon franchise is popular, and I actually like the two mainline Horizon games. I think that they're both really good examples of what they're trying to be, which is to say, you know, very light RPG mechanics layered on top of a pretty compelling action adventure game with a decent story and a good world. Wonderful art direction. You know, I think that those games are very unique. I think that they you know, strike a chord with people, certainly visually and conceptually, but I don't know that they've permeated the zeitgeist necessarily in a way that I know that there's been a bunch of talk about like Horizon MMOs and stuff like that. I question the degree to which people are going to show up for this game, and whether that degree will in any way match the amount of investment that needs to be made in order to have a game like this that actually runs. So I don't know. To me, it feels like the most natural fit Sony has in their in their sort of arsenal. But I suppose for fit it should have been a wardrobe, shouldn't it? But the reality of that is like, yeah, I can absolutely see that one flopping or being another sort of, well, it's pretty good. Anyway, what's next? Sort of game. And yeah, I mean, that's not a great success to look forward to, but that's on my projection there.
Well, if I may, you know, just taking a look at this catalog that I've just mentioned, and this isn't even all of the live service ambitions that Sony has had. It's just the ones that I remembered and could kind of chat a little bit more on. But if we look at The Last of Us, if we look at God of War, if we look at Horizon Zero Dawn, if you were to come to me and try to pitch me on a multiplayer version of any of these games, Aaron, I'd be like, what are you doing? These IPs are not ones that are, in my opinion, set up to be good for multiplayer. I think that's part of Sony's problem, is that they've got all these IPs that, yes, they are very much loved, but like the minute that you try to turn them into some kind of weird multiplayer live service game, I think you just like take a lot of the magic out of it, because a lot of the things that they're known for with like the narrative, you just don't get in live service multiplayer games. And so it's just like, why the fuck am I even playing that? Like you could play a better multiplayer game. Like, here's my hot take. I've talked about it before. I think Sony's strong lane is that they are solid with their narrative and telling it throughout a story. I do not think they are consistently that great at coming up with like unique gameplay mechanics and unique, I mean, that's really it. And I think that's what makes a multiplayer game better, is like having a really tight gameplay loop, having gameplay mechanics. Like, they are not narrative games generally, with the exception of, I do think Titanfall 2 had a really decent story that was concise, whatever. But my bigger point here, they're just not doing it right. Like, Sony's so fixated on turning their single player franchises into these live services, and I think that's stupid. I just think, who the fuck wants this stuff? I mean, I'm sure people want it, but I think that the people making the decisions are stupid for chasing that.
I don't disagree with you. What it reminds me of a great deal is back in the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, after multiplayer, right, online multiplayer, had its proof of concept moments, and people with Call of Duty realized that the single player campaign was no longer the path forward for continued engagement, right? You want somebody invested in your game. You want somebody continuing to spend money on your game. Multiplayer is the way to do this shit, right? And suddenly, magically, overnight, every single player game, usually a sequel to a successful single player game, had a multiplayer mode. It happened to Assassin's Creed. It happened in Uncharted. The Uncharted games started getting multiplayer modes. It happened to BioShock. It happened to a gajillion other games, where they would just develop these, in some cases actually pretty interesting, because they could be a lot more experimental because they were smaller, and that's the point. Modes for like Assassin's Creed had actually weirdly compelling multiplayer, and The Last of Us had a pretty popular multiplayer mode there for a while. But, and it's a big but, two things to note about all of those. I mean, well, three. One, a lot of the time they were just completely shoehorned in and they sucked, and nobody played them. But they were cheap to make back then. So if the multiplayer mode on a single player game failed, it didn't really matter that much in comparison to now, where you've got, hundreds of $millions getting sunk into these projects that'll never see the light of day, and then you close studios like Bluepoint, which have really only made certified bangers for your platform. The consequences of these projects not even coming together anymore are so much more dire than they used to be. And also, to your point, most of those multiplayer modes would not have sold a copy of that game were it not for the fact that they were bundled in with the single player experience. The Last of Us multiplayer, I never really got into, but by all accounts, it was very compelling. Like, a lot of people really liked it and thought that it was, a good way to continue spending time within that world. But the idea to me of wanting to spend time in the world of The Last of Us without any of the characters that I have an emotional attachment to, or who make that world feel as alive and distinct as it is, I can't imagine why I would want to do that. Like, I don't know why that world would be the backdrop for that kind of experience. Kind of like with FTC Firebreak, Zach. Do you remember FTC Firebreak, or FBC Firebreak rather?
I do not remember.
It was Remedy's attempt at a live service game to help continue funding all of their single player games, and they made a Federal Bureau of Control live service shooter that did not, to the best of my understanding, harness the weirdness of Control, because it takes place in the same universe as Control and Alan Wake 2 and Alan Wake and the Remedy verse. But the hooks of Control, meaning, the narrative, the weird world, the curious aesthetic decisions, the sort of weird dimensional ripping and whatnot. None of that is really like front and center present, which means that tonally it doesn't feel congruous with the stuff that people liked from Control. And then, just sort of layering that over a lackluster live service shooter is not enough to guarantee you a success, right? And that game came out and it was a massive flop, much to my chagrin, because I love Remedy and I wanted them to be successful and able to self-fund and self-publish and all that stuff. But yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at, is just taking these worlds that were not built for multiplayer and trying to mash multiplayer and live service components into them is just a bad idea. And currently, I don't think there's anybody doing it worse on a larger scale than Sony. Sony is doing a genuinely terrible job allocating resources to these projects that are flawed from the ideation phase. And I'm sorry I've been talking for 100,000 years now, but that's, yeah, I agree. There's just not been many fruits born from these projects, and I think a lot of it is just because the leadership is making questionable decisions purely on the back of having liked and lovable IP in their arsenal. That's just bad decision making.
Well, I think that, I'm not going to say that you couldn't have a successful Horizon or The Last of Us or God of War multiplayer game. I think the problem is that my perception is Sony is forcing it down people's throats instead of letting that come up organically.
Right. Who's asking for a God of War live service game? Someone might be asking for a Horizon MMO, but who the fuck is asking for multiplayer Kratos?
Yeah. No, God of War and The Last of Us, I think, are particularly egregious. With Horizon Hunter's Gathering, again, I think the title is ass, mostly because I keep wanting to say Hunter and Gatherer, because it's like it co-opts my brain into the wrong title. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The Horizon game, I at least conceptually understand where that train of thought comes from for why this could be a compelling thing. I think their biggest issue is that they made a big miss going with the cartoony art style. I don't really know why they did that, because it makes it feel so off-brand to me. And granted, I haven't played a ton of the Horizon games. I've only played a little bit of the first one, but regardless of that, strange choice. The only other thing I want to mention, and I think, we probably don't have as much time to kind of go into some of the Epic stuff that we think ties in, but talking about the options, I think, is an important thing to end on. But before I do that, to our point that we're just discussing, I never played the first Marathon game. It was definitely before my time. But I think a lot of people were really hoping that Bungie was going to be making a real sequel to Marathon and not a, multiplayer only extraction shooter. And so, to our point of Sony kind of forcing live service into everything in a very specific way, I think people are pretty bummed out about there not being a ton of kind of narrative and lore being explored. Which maybe there is, but I think Arc Raiders generally does a pretty good job of doing that in their game, but I don't know, if you're attracting a hardcore PvP audience, you're probably not as focused on the story, or maybe you're able to be. I don't know. I just feel like an extraction shooter was not what people were hoping for. I think people probably wanted a Marathon game that was similar to Destiny, right? Where it was more narrative focused, RPG kind of a thing, and not a competitive extraction shooter. But yeah.
Agreed. And I've definitely heard that criticism levied against the game pretty enthusiastically. I get that. I get that very well. I remember when we were talking about this game initially, way back when, we were talking about the fact that the narrative stuff still hadn't been written back when they'd initially done that alpha.
I honest to God didn't even remember that. That's so bad. Yeah, that's so fucking bad.
So my answer to that is yes, but the game is out. The game exists now. And I think that is, considering the hurdles it had to overcome to get to launch, borderline miraculous that it launched at all. I would 100% agree. I like a little bit of story. I like a lot of bit of story. I think that lore and world building would be something that would absolutely bring me back into a world, especially something that's, repetitive and grindy and punishing and whatnot. Having a reason to sort of explore and understand the space would definitely give me something to cling to. And I completely understand a property that you really like being strip mined just for the name is pretty disappointing. So I completely understand that, but there's no way on the planet, this planet or Tau Ceti or any other, that you're gonna get Marathon from where it was 8 months ago to where it needed to be on March 5th while also writing a story. It just wasn't going to happen. Not saying it shouldn't have happened, but it just never was going to. But yeah, that all aside, do you want to kind of speculate what happens next, like where there's the potential to go from here?
Yeah, no, I think that's a solid place to end, and maybe we can even tie in some of these other points. Just wanted to say It's very funny that Marathon released in the same month as Project Hail Mary, where they also go to Tau Ceti.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, no, so very, very strange coincidence that those two things coincide. Yeah, so in terms of what could kind of happen here, I mean, I think there's a bunch of different options. I'm just going to talk about what I think is the least likely one first, because I think it's going to be quick. There are some commentators in the space that have suggested that this game could ruin Bungie and potentially get the studio closed. I do not believe that that is going to be the outcome. The reason I don't think that's going to be the outcome is, one, the game does have a target audience that's sizable enough that I don't think Sony's going to want to just shut off the game fully. I think it would largely make it look like they're divesting from the live service market, given the game wasn't a complete failure. And I think it's going to make people not trust any other live service game that comes out, especially because by all reasonable metrics, Marathon is like a good, successful game that shouldn't be killed, probably. And it would just look really bad if Sony killed one of the most legacy studios that is tied to a very nostalgic franchise being Halo. So I don't think that's going to happen personally. It could be the beginning of the downfall, although I would argue that was probably something that they did with Destiny 2 was probably the beginning of the downfall. It could be another, arrow in the quiver of downfall for them. But I don't think this will spell the doom of Bungie in the immediate future.
Yeah. My gut instinct, and this kind of ties back to this is the worst possible outcome for Sony. I don't think that they are going to risk the reputational hit of dissolving Bungie. If they were to dissolve Bungie, they would probably try to retain as much of the staff as possible and just shovel them around to other live service studios within the quiver so that they could at least, mine a little bit more value out of the purchase for their sort of live service future. But yeah, I don't think that Sony wants to be, especially after the run of studio closures that they've just gone on, I really don't think that they want to be the people who killed the guys that made Halo. I just don't think that they want to do that. And I don't think that they can reputationally, both in terms of like fan sentiment and investor sentiment, get away with killing a game that is reviewing extremely well and is drawing a committed audience, like an audience that actually really cares about this game and really likes it and is finding it toothsome and gripping and all of this stuff. So I don't think we're going to see this soft landing be the swan song of Bungie, and I do think that Marathon has done enough to sort of solidify its space as a going concern. The question now becomes, to what degree will Sony support Marathon moving forward?
Yeah, and I I
and
struggle.
what happens to Bungie.
Yeah, and what happens to Bungie? Well, Bungie's already been losing a lot of its autonomy from Sony with their CEO leaving a while ago and then not being replaced, which suggests that, Sony has full kind of executive leadership as it pertains to that role. To Bungie just made a lot of bad financial decisions as well. So I think Sony's done giving them a long leash. That being said, I don't have high hopes for Sony. I'm not a Sony fanboy. I feel like the reality here of what's going to happen is if they're going to continue to further invest, they might do it for a few more seasons just to see if they can try to get that player CCU up, although it's going to be really, really hard unless they can really get some solid word of mouth, especially if they don't make the first-time user experience better. People are just going to bounce off this game regardless of whether it's hardcore or not hardcore. I think the hardcore element of it, unless they sand it down, is going to be a big turnoff. But if they get rid of that, it's going to drive away the community that does enjoy the game now. So I don't know. It's truly a bit of a rough situation, and I just don't 100% know how much they're willing to invest in the game more, considering they spent $3.7 billion to ultimately get this game made, because their intention of buying Bungie was to have them make a new Sony first game in the live service market. And then that's not even including the development costs. And there's a huge burn rate with a lot of these online games. So my gut feeling here, Sony's probably got layoffs in the future for them. Developers are probably going to get laid off. The amount of developers that will get laid off, I don't know. But they'll probably try to cut costs. And then if they can't get these CCUs up to where they want, I think they're just going to quiet quit the game and slowly kind of move it over to a maintenance mode. And then maybe try to work on a Destiny 3 or some other IP that they think is a little bit safer of a bet. But yeah, it's kind of hard to know.
Yeah, it is extremely hard to know. My hope, honestly, would be that they continue to operate the game at this level for, a little bit longer than a season or two, just because I think, and I understand that they're very different genres, and I understand that the audience expectations are very different and that the audiences themselves are very different, but the boom of hardcore games in the vein of the output of FromSoft has definitely shown that there is an audience for there's an audience of people who want to be challenged, who want to have experiences in games that are uncompromising in both their mechanics and their art, right? And their narrative, right? So there's so much potential in my mind for a game this foundationally solid to slowly grow over a year, 2 years, X number of years into, I can see an article like, the gaming's best kept secret is Marathon, or something like that, where people eventually find this game and realize that, if they can get through that first time experience, that first time user experience, that there is something really worth playing here. I can see the wind blowing in that direction and the game becoming not the most explosive hit, but certainly a powerhouse within its own space, where just, pure mechanical excellence and aesthetic bravery can carry it to, cult status that can eventually become profitable. The question is, is my speculation completely baseless? Good question. And also, if it's not completely baseless, will Sony executives be willing to put in the time and money it will take to get us to that point? Because maybe they think that that's still achievable with a lot less investment. Maybe it is. I don't know. My gut is that Sony is probably not going to continue to treat this as a flagship product for all that long if it's not drawing in flagship numbers. I don't like that that's the answer, but that is almost certainly what will happen. Sony has not recently indicated that they are patient in the slightest, and are certainly willing to make big, bold cuts for the sake of the bottom line, which, if Marathon is not helping them achieve their goals, it may just be shuffled off to another slightly less prevalent position in their lineup.
Yeah, I think just some quick closing thoughts on what you just said. I think one of the big issues is that over the course of like the last 3 years, they've already fired around 222 people from Bungie. The studio is not running at the capacity that it should be to be able to support both Destiny and Marathon, which I do think is a real liability for them when they've got 2 live service games now that are both arguably not making the money that they want either of them to make. So that's going to be an interesting thing to view when looking at Sony. And then in addition to that, just commenting on the hardcore comment that you had, the one hurdle that we're going to face, or they're going to face, making that transition that Dark Souls was able to do, is that online games that are hardcore, air quotes, are intrinsically more sweaty and have griefing, and that toxicity that comes from hardcore competitive games is going to be way more caustic, and it's going to hurt the game when it comes to getting a critical, or not critical appeal, but mass appeal, more so than like a hardcore single player game. Like a hardcore single player game, you don't feel like you're actively being bullied because you're never actually actively being bullied. You can literally be bullied in hardcore PvP games.
Yes.
And I think that hurdle, I just don't think they're going to be able to overcome that unless they do something weird with toxicity that's never been done. Like, League of Legends has been failing to do for years and years and years. So I don't really see that happening personally. Obviously, it'd be cool to see that kind of growth in some way if they can achieve it. But I think griefing is just going to make that really unlikely in my mind.
Yeah. I think the unpredictability of the human element is certainly... There's a lot of that at play here. I think that's a very fair assessment.
Well, with all of that, I didn't get through necessarily everything, but I think we've hit most of the important things as it pertains to Marathon and Sony moving forward. So I'm personally good to move on to our thank yous.
Then may I begin by thanking Beach Girl.
Oh, that was an actual question. I thought you were.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to go into the thank you. I didn't know you were looking for a
response.
No,
I was trying to be polite.
You may.
Oh, thank you very much. And also thank you very much to Beach Girl. Beach Girl is, of course, the provider of our wonderful intro and outro music, as well as the creator and curator of a wonderful library of music that you can find in some limited capacity, but certainly slightly diminished from where it once was. On all of the better streaming, not better, but just extant streaming platforms. So, your YouTubes, your SoundClouds, Bandcamps, Spotify's. If it has digital music, it most likely has some representation from Beach Girl. So do go ahead and check out their music. You can also find, if you can get over the SEO hurdle, you can still find some of their music under electric guitar as well, which is really, really good. And huge thank you to Beach Girl. Check them out, and your ears will thank you.
And I would like to thank Muscat Marquette, our friend who helped us with our wonderful podcast logo and a lot of our initial art for this podcast. You can, I believe, still find them on Instagram. Sadly, there is no way to give them money of any kind, so just send positive vibes their way. We truly appreciate you, Muscat Marquette.
Always.
And with that, I think it is safe for us to say adieu. So until next time, thanks everybody for tuning in. Talk to y'all later. Goodbye.
Indeed. Goodbye.
Hit that thing a like.
Hit that thing a like.